Welcome to DW News. We're streaming live from Berlin on YouTube and TikTok and TV, of course. I'm Nicole Fröhlich. I'm in the studio, joined by Max Hoffman, our Berlin bureau chief, because the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is in Berlin for talks with the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz. His visit marks the first official German-Ukrainian government consultations in years and had been kept under wraps for security reasons. I'm sure we have some pictures of Zelensky arriving here in Berlin. He was received with military honors there. You can see him on the red carpet with the German Chancellor. We're waiting for a joint press conference of the two leaders. But in the meantime, there's plenty to talk about with Max here in the studio and Nick Connolly in Kyiv. We're just trying to get that line up, and our chief political editor, Michaela Küfner, is at the press conference, so we will go live to her as soon as that is over. If you have questions for any of them about this meeting or the general state of affairs between Germany and Ukraine or the situation in Ukraine on the battlefield, post them in the comments and we'll try to answer them for you. Max, let's start with you. Quite a surprise visit, but it had been a long time in the making, right?
Right. It's been a while since the last time, and what we're hearing is that this is considered to be an extremely important visit because it comes, as you know, at a historically very important time, because what's happening in Ukraine affects other conflicts as well, just like other conflicts in the Middle East, for example, affect what's happening in Ukraine. So it's all connected at the moment, and we're sort of at a watershed moment. And what's really interesting to see is that how the role of Zelensky has evolved over the years. In the beginning, safe to say he was more of a petitioner, right? Trying to get some money. He's still trying to get money. That's a big topic. But he's also more of a strategic partner. That's something that the Germans really emphasize. This has become a strategic partnership.
How so?
Because the Germans can learn a lot from the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have withstood largely the Russian invasion for over 4 years now. They have learned a lot of things about drone warfare. You could say that Zelensky at the moment is a drone diplomat. There's drone diplomacy going on in the Middle East, and the Germans are building drones together with the Ukrainians. In fact, one joint venture has started shipping drones to Ukraine just recently. And it's very safe to say that the Germans and the German army, the Bundeswehr, is also learning in this process from the Ukrainians what these drones need to be able to do.
So it's not a one-way street, and that is what this meeting is all about, right? So what can we expect from today's meeting?
I think we'll see later, obviously, you know, no crystal ball, but the main message is going to be from the Germans: we stand by you. We're here. We're here to support you also financially. And if there is sort of kind of a division of labor within the European Union, then, you know, the southern countries like Italy, France are more in charge of the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Germans are firmly in charge of supporting Ukraine. That's going to be the main message, but also what I just said, you know, emphasizing the strategic partnership aspect of the whole thing and how they can support each other.
Yeah, Germany is Europe's largest contributor of military aid to Ukraine. I have some numbers here: 55 billion euros in military aid. Civilian support amounts to 39 billion. How is that ongoing support? Because we're in the 5th year of this war. How is that viewed among German society?
It's almost 100 billion euros. And so that makes Germany the second largest donor worldwide after the United States. In Germany, just take a step back here, you always have a governing coalition. So a number of different parties working together. And the current coalition is very clear in their support for Ukraine. Of course, on the fringes of the political system, which are not so much fringes anymore. If you look, for example, at the far right, the AfD, the support for Ukraine dwindles. Those are parties...
Very Russia-friendly
very
also
Russia-friendly,
in part of that party.
They're big, and maybe we'll talk about that too. They're big, well, not idle, but their big example in the last 16 years was Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, who was very close to Russia, and who did everything within his power to withhold substantial amounts of support, financial support for Ukraine in the last weeks, notably a 90 billion euro fund. And so if they're the big, blueprint here for the far-right AfD, then it's very clear you also in Germany have people who do not think this is a great idea to give so much support to Ukraine, confront Russia in this way, but would like to see more sort of cooperation with Russia. But that's not the case for the current German governing coalition. And also trying to think of the latest numbers I saw in the polls for Germans, but the Germans, a majority of Germans does support what's happening in support of Ukraine at the moment.
I believe we can now bring in our Kyiv correspondent, Nick Connolly. Nick, if you can hear me, how are these talks being viewed there in Ukraine?
I think this is about kind of routine shoring up of ties. Certainly the relationship with the current German government is a lot better than with its predecessor. Friedrich Merz was someone who's seen here in Ukraine as being a kind of conviction politician when it comes to Ukraine. He was very loud in his support of Ukraine before he was elected. He made some promises he wasn't able to keep in terms of sending Taurus missiles, for instance, but that gesture is remembered. And I think there is a sense right now that Ukraine just needs to basically prepare for the long haul. There is no sense that the Russians are going to go anywhere from their maximalist demands. We've seen the Trump administration basically disengaging from the push to bring both sides to the table now because of what's happening in the Middle East. And we even had Friedrich Merz in the last couple of months saying that basically this is now going to be about which country can keep on fighting longest. And Ukraine on its own obviously can't do that, but the EU as a whole is significantly wealthier, has much bigger resources militarily and also financially if it were to work together effectively than Russia does. And so it's about basically making things routine, making that cooperation something that is beyond politics, beyond kind of having to ask for every 10, 15 Patriot interceptor missiles, but something that just happens of course, and is kind of for the long term. So that's kind of the hope here. And I think there is a sense that Germany is now willing to be a bit more proactive. We've seen Germany looking for interceptor missiles for the Patriots, trying to say if the rest of Europe finds those missiles from their stocks, we will give this much. So there is a sense now that Germany is slightly more proactive and more willing to kind of take a risk than wasn't the case in the past.
That was Nick Connolly, our Ukraine correspondent. I'm here in the studio with Max Kaufmann. If you're just joining us now, we are following a quite historic, in a way, visit by Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, to Germany. It's the first official government consultation between Germany and Ukraine in over 20 years. If you have any questions about this, about the state of affairs in Ukraine that you think Max Hoffman, our Berlin bureau chief, or Nick in Ukraine could answer, feel free to post them in the chat on TikTok or on YouTube. We'll be happy to pass them on to them. Nick, Max earlier mentioned the election in Hungary on Sunday. A change of command is coming up there. Is that going to be one of the topics that Volodymyr Zelensky will be discussing with the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz?
I think that's definitely going to be pretty near the top of the agenda. It has to be. I mean, these elections were followed very closely in Ukraine because Viktor Orban simply had made Ukraine basically public enemy number one and tried to kind of style this whole election as a referendum against Ukraine and the EU. Ursula von der Leyen he accused those two parties of interfering in Hungary. And we've seen Hungary blocking aid to Ukraine. We've also seen the depth of the contacts that existed between the Orban government and the Kremlin. So there's a real kind of interest here in Ukraine now, seeing where that new government lies. We've heard already from Petr Magyar that he's not going to block those 90 billion, but we've heard some things that have made people here in Ukraine uneasy about EU membership. He said that he doesn't see it happening in the next decade, and that is simply something here can't really imagine. They can't imagine going out of this war, rebuilding, and having to wait a decade before they are in the European club, especially now that NATO seems to be off the table for Ukraine. So I think it's going to be a big push from the Ukrainians to try and get Western European capitals to, behind the scenes, talk to the new Hungarian leadership and try and get them to tone that down, because, a decade away, maybe a referendum in Hungary, and given the state of public opinion in Hungary after years of kind of Orban's rhetoric there, that is all something that is very scary for Ukrainians who want to get this country into Europe as quickly as possible.
Max, here in the studio with me, you're of course aware of everything that's being discussed behind the scenes in Berlin, in the government quarter where we have.
There's a lot being discussed.
There's a lot, but you have an ear to the ground. How would you rate this approach? Is this a smart move by Zelensky to kind of go through the back door to Hungary's new leader, kind of rally the troops he knows he already has on his side, to kind of tell them, hey, could you maybe put a word in for me? Because we really need Hungary on our side as well.
I'm not sure I would go along with that description because this was one of the dominant topics in Brussels of the last weeks, that Hungary refused to go along with clearing that 90 billion euro loan. So it was really very much out in the open. What was happening behind the scenes was that there was a lot of reproaching between Hungary and Ukraine, even some theories that maybe Ukraine was withholding some of the oil that was supposed to go in the direction of Hungary through Ukraine. So things like that happening on the sidelines. And even, if what Nick talked about, EU membership might not be as much in the cards as the Ukrainians hope for, this 90 billion euro loan very much seems, at the moment, it seems very likely that this will go ahead, because in theory it was already clear. That's what made everybody so mad, including the Germans, because in theory it was cleared already. And then at the last minute, really, Orban refused. Many thought it was due to his campaign. He thought it would help him in his campaign in Hungary. But it really, I think it's safe to say, infuriated a lot of officials also here in Germany. And it's hard to imagine the new guy doing the same thing.
All right. We have some questions coming in on the chat. Thank you so much for those. Leonidas wants to know, shouldn't Germany have a more, quote unquote, hands-on contribution in Ukraine, like soldiers, for example? What do you say to that?
Yeah, hi Leonidas. Thanks for the question. That's a question of opinion. You could see it either way. I'm sure there are some in Germany who think, and you sometimes, remember the contribution in the beginning. There was a discussion about helmets, the Germans contributing helmets. We have come a long way since then. And what's also important to remember is that Ukraine itself, and I'm sure Nick could confirm that, has a very powerful arms industry by itself. They learned a lot in the last 4 years how to construct long-range missiles, for example, and especially drones. And that's what we talked about in the beginning. That's why you have those joint ventures. So very different things are needed now than 4 years ago. We're not talking about tanks anymore, for example. That was the big discussion in the early days. Could the Germans contribute tanks? It's no longer the case. They need other things. They need drones. And yes, for the already existing arms industry, increased arms industry in Ukraine, they need a lot of money. So at the point where we are with the warfare, that is what Zelensky, at least is asking from the Germans, and that's something they can contribute at this point.
Yeah. Over to you, Nick, in Ukraine. What does Ukraine want from its European allies right now? What does it need the most? And maybe, as a follow-up, how much of that can Zelensky get on this visit to Berlin, if anything at all?
I think it's definitely about cash in the short term. Just about kind of keeping everything going here, the kind of government machinery, keeping wages and pensions paid for. It's also about having the money to use all the capacity that private defense companies here in Ukraine have, right? There are various statistics going around, but it certainly seems like there are still billions and billions of euros worth of weapons that could be produced in this country if there was enough money, if that money was coming in from outside and Ukraine's government was able to contract those firms to produce more in the way of drones and other. So that's the first thing. I think in terms of kind of middle and longer term, obviously peacekeepers are something that would be very welcome. Maybe something a bit like what Germany is doing in Lithuania, kind of tripwire, having a base somewhere that doesn't necessarily, stop a Russian invasion, but at least slows it down. But whether that would be along the front lines or somewhere in Western Ukraine, just as a kind of backup to allow Ukraine to focus its attentions, its troops along the front lines closer. Russian-occupied territory is a different question, and I think people in Ukraine understand that politically that's going to be very difficult to sell to the German public. The other countries in Europe, like the UK and France, have been a bit more forthcoming when it comes to talking about peacekeepers. But then again, after kind of initial initiatives from people like Keir Starmer, who said he was willing to put UK troops in harm's way here in Ukraine, they then have all said, well, that is all based on having some kind of American protection from the skies, planes if we're going to put our troops so close to Russia. So I think it's all pretty kind of far away, that kind of discussion. But certainly, in the future, Ukraine is going to want to stay very heavily militarized to protect itself from future Russian attacks. There is no sense here that Russia is going to basically give up on trying to take the rest of Ukraine, that Russia's ambitions are somehow over. There might be some kind of pause to the fighting, some kind of armistice, maybe a couple of years of peace like we saw after 2014. But there is a sense here that Ukraine has to prepare for the long term and stay armed and be basically dangerous enough that Russia thinks again.
Yeah. You were just seeing, and you can still see it there down in the corner below my face, pictures from the Chancellery in Berlin. We're just waiting for Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz to take the stage after their meeting here in Berlin. While we wait, everybody's already sitting down, so that's a good sign. It might not take much longer, but while we wait, they have a tight schedule. There's a lot to talk about. Nick, maybe back to you while we wait. How important is Germany as an ally to Ukraine at this moment in time, especially taking into account that, we've seen peace negotiations that the EU wasn't a part of. So what is Germany to Ukraine right now?
Well, if you look at the statistics, now that the US has basically gone as a donor to Ukraine, Germany is by far the largest single nation in terms of donations and support for Ukraine. Obviously, the EU, if you put it together, is bigger, but Germany has been crucial in terms of keeping the kind of government machine on here, but also in terms of providing weapons. Also, for instance, giving up lots of its Patriot missile defense systems in a way that lots of other European countries simply haven't been willing to. So that is pretty unparalleled in terms of now the kind of cooperation between Ukraine's defense industry and German defense companies. You've seen Germany's defense sector actually grow very significantly during this conflict. Companies like Rheinmetall kind of, in the kind of middle field internationally before this war, now very much kind of prominent and in the headlines because of the weapon systems they've sent here. Things like Diehl is the company that produced the IRIS-T air defense system that has proven very successful against cruise missiles here. So I think there is a kind of depth in terms of the defense cooperation that is pretty unparalleled, and also in terms of the volumes of financial aid. That means that Ukraine basically can't carry on fighting without German support and also without German lobbying in Brussels. Obviously, other countries like France are very involved too. The connection between Emmanuel Macron and Volodymyr Zelensky is kind of obvious. They have a rapport, but in terms of the actual hard facts and the money being sent, France just can't compare in terms of what it sends. The UK similarly to what Germany does.
Mm-hmm. Let's take a step back here because we have a question on TikTok that I think Max can give us a good answer to. Evcotech is asking, the EU is financing a country that is no member of the EU, is also not a member of NATO. Why? Why is support for Ukraine so important for Europe?
Well, you can have partnerships as the EU has partnerships, cooperations with also security partnerships with other countries that are not part of NATO or part of the EU. Actually, that's a very effective method of making sure that on the fringes of the EU you stay safe. And the thinking of many people in the EU, many officials, is that the Ukraine right now is defending EU security also. It's right next door. I mean, from where we're sitting here, what is it, 1,000 kilometers, something like that? Maybe a bit more, that's close. And also the question is, if this was easy for Russia and Putin to just take Ukraine, what would it mean for actual EU members on the eastern flank of the EU? For example, the Baltic states up there that have large Russian communities also. So this is perceived, although Ukraine is not a member of the EU, not a member of NATO, very much as a European security effort.
European security effort. And Bacon Gaming 124 is asking on YouTube, do you think aid to Ukraine will increase in the upcoming months? We already talked about this 90 billion aid to Ukraine. We talked about this 90 billion euro loan that has been held up by Hungary. Hopes are that that money will now be able to flow. But other than that, do you see more efforts coming out specifically of Germany?
As long as we have this government in place, I see this continuing, and this constellation in the European Union. Of course, you have democracies that will change. You have an important election in France, for example, next year. You have an election in I believe in Poland as well. But Ukraine, I mean, Zelensky, he's on a drone diplomacy all over the world. He's also getting new financial resources and resources in general from the Gulf states, for example, that have been attacked by Iran, that are now scrambling to somehow get some defenses in place to make sure that they can safeguard their oil and gas production facilities. And nobody knows better how to do that because those are the same drones that are flying in Ukraine from Iranian production. Nobody knows better how to do that than the Ukrainians. So Zelensky, on the drone diplomacy, is going to the Gulf states saying, we can help you. And of course, he gets something in return as well. You're talking resources, you're talking diesel, you're talking also financial resources. So the EU is not the only game in town, but they are the most important game in town at the moment. And with the current constellation, especially with Hungary switching leaders, things are looking good if you are, or better than before if you're Zelensky. Yeah. I would go that far.
Nick, how is that change of posture and attitude that Max is describing on behalf of Volodymyr Zelensky, the way that he's going out into the world saying, you know, it's not only that we need stuff, we can also bring something to the table. Is that something that is being noticed in Ukraine?
Definitely. I think Ukrainians for a long time have thought that they are basically guaranteeing the European security, not just their own, that they are buying Europe time to rearm and prepare for some future Russian attack. I think the difference is now that the rest of the world is maybe paying more attention to that and more invested. I think going back also to what Max was saying about the money, I think what's really crucial is not just having the money, but also having the actual capacity of industry in the US, in Europe, to produce all these weapons that Ukraine needs, particularly when it comes to air defense, to the Patriot system. We've seen huge numbers of interceptors being fired in the Middle East in the last few weeks. And that is, by some calculations, more than the annual production of the entire US industrial base that produces these interceptors for the Patriots. So the question will be not just do you have the money, but will the Trump administration put Ukraine at the front of the queue or in the middle or at the back of the queue when it comes to new supplies? So we're now talking of special deals being done for a few dozen interceptor missiles each time, and to basically reliably shoot down one ballistic missile coming from Russia, you would probably need 2 or maybe 3 interceptor missiles. So that's 10 ballistic missiles reliably intercepted, stopped if you get a tranche of 30 of these interceptors. So that is really the crux here. Now trying to find Ukraine, trying to look for cheaper, more modern ways to shoot down these missiles and things that they can build themselves rather than having to basically beg the Americans to sell them something at huge cost.
We're now hearing from the Reuters news agency that Germany and Ukraine are to sign an agreement on economic collaboration and reconstruction and an agreement on defense. So you were right on a lot of points you raised there earlier. We'll bring you more when we get it, but I want to touch on one point. We're talking about reconstruction. There was also talks going into this meeting about bringing back the Ukrainian refugees. Isn't it a bit early to be talking about this because there is no sign of this war ending anytime soon?
You could say so. On the other hand, things like that, you don't decide them, from one day to another. This needs preparation. This needs plans. Also, it requires that you assess the damage, right? That's why during wars, you always have NGOs, for example, but also government assessing what is actually the human cost, of course, the most important cost, but also the cost of destruction and all that to get ready later. Also to maybe think of how you can use Russian resources that are frozen in the EU to do this. And it also sends a signal. It's the signal of we're here to stay. We're also here for when this war is over, and we do think that this war will be over at a certain point. So it's also an important signal, but you need to prepare these things in advance. So yeah, it seems early because no end of this conflict is in sight, but maybe this will go faster than everybody thinks. Maybe not.
I mean, we should hope so, but let's look at the Ukrainian refugees here in Germany, because it's a topic, the topic of refugees, of foreigners in the country, that Friedrich Merz is known to raise, and it's been seen widely as pandering to the far right. Would you say that that is the case here as well? How are Ukrainian refugees seen in German society? Is this really something that needs to be talked about right now when really the fighting is still continuing?
I was thinking about how you phrased it, saying pandering to the far right, and I was wondering whether this is actually true. Because Germans have expressed in many polls over the year that this was an important topic to them, migration, right? And that they felt like it was out of control after 2015 when you had a lot of Syrian refugees coming into Germany, where the mood switched pretty quickly from being extremely welcoming, I don't know if you remember the pictures of that, to, okay, and what are we actually going to do with all these people?
We can
right?
do it. It was a big moment for Germany as well, yeah.
And then after that, you kind of had the discussion when the Ukrainian refugees came, aren't they being treated much, much better than the Syrian refugees? And there was also talk about, you know, racism, that Ukrainians would be treated better than Syrians just because they came from Syria and because of that background and all of that. But overall, it is an important topic to Germans, not the most important topic at the moment. That would be the economy. And so you could also argue and say if Merz is trying to take care of that topic, he is doing what people actually expect from him and on the ticket that he ran. If he's doing a good job about it, if he's always choosing the right words, that's a completely different story. But yes, people, a lot of people, at least in Germany, not all people, but a lot of people feel like the German state is spending too much money without asking the right questions on refugees in general, but also on Ukrainian refugees. That is a big discussion in Germany. And, you know, people answer it differently depending on what their views are on it. But overall, in the public space, big topic.
Nick, I want to know from you, how are these topics, if they're being discussed at all, in Ukraine? You know, the return of the people who fled the war when it broke out, the full-scale invasion that Russia launched on Ukraine.
I think in terms of people coming back, the thing I've seen here in Kiev that you hear anecdotally from lots of people you talk to is that those people who were willing to come back during wartime came back already. They came basically in the summer of 2022, a couple of months into this war, once it became clear that the Russians weren't going to take Kiev, that the war was kind of localized more in the south and the east. There you saw a kind of wave of people coming back. But since then, the other people who basically didn't make the move in 22 for the most part have stayed abroad, have decided to stick it out until this war is over and then decide if by then they haven't basically put down roots that are so stable in the countries in Europe where most of them are, that they decide not to return. I think it's also important to say that there are loads of internally displaced people here in Ukraine. The numbers are all pretty difficult to kind of really pin down because lots of people are registered in different places. There hasn't been a proper census in Ukraine for a long time. But anecdotally, you know, Kiev feels basically as busy as it did before the war. But you basically have lots of people from Kharkiv, from Dnipro, from the east and the south who have moved west to safety. So it's not like, you know, Ukraine doesn't have to deal with lots of internal refugees. I think there is an understanding here in Ukraine. You hear people talking to you about it, that, you know, it is probably time for people who have moved west to countries like Germany to start working if they haven't done so. Some people have talked to me that they are surprised that sometimes people can spend years in language courses on various kinds of government support benefits before they're really kind of forced into getting into the job market. But we do also see in countries like Poland, in countries like Denmark, that Ukrainians have been very successful at getting into work. And there actually has been criticism of the German approach to kind of encourage people to do lots of language courses and integration courses before they actually get down to work and paying taxes. So I think there's also some questions there to the German system and the kind of maybe slightly perfectionist approach, trying to get people very prepared before letting them take a kind of bite into the labour market.
Max, you looked like you wanted to add something.
I have a question for Nick, if I may.
Yeah, sure.
Nick, you're aware of the discussion of Ukrainian men who actually, I think, would be obligated to serve in the Ukrainian army being in Germany. Is that a big discussion in Ukraine at the moment?
I think people have kind of, for the most part, accepted that that's not going to happen, right? Because, you know, you're sending men back to military service to a dangerous country. That would take lots of probably illegal changes. That was at least the explanation you heard from experts in the past. But certainly, you know, this is a very contentious topic inside the country, right? There were recent changes to allow younger men after the age of 18 to leave the country. Obviously, they can't leave once they hit military age at 25 and a few years before that. But there's basically a kind of cohort of younger men, many of whom are now leaving the country to, leave while they still can, basically. That's also very contentious. Lots of critics of Zelensky and his government have called that basically a kind of populist move that is undermining the ability of the military to recruit enough men, enough people. So that is all very contentious. I think people just didn't realistically believe that this could actually change in Germany, that we even have situations where people that the Ukrainian judicial system wants can't be sent to Ukraine because of the war.
Let me jump in there because the press conference that we've been waiting for has just started.
The first document signed is the agreement concerning data cooperation between the Ministry of Defense of the Federal Republic of Germany and the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. The arrangement is signed on the Ukrainian side by the Minister of Defense, Mr. Mikhailo Fedorov, on the German side by the Federal Minister of Defense, Mr. Boris Pistorius.
Defense cooperation, you mentioned it earlier.
Yeah, you got to keep in mind there are a lot of Ukrainian ministers in town at the moment. So it's the cooperation agreements that are being signed are in different areas, different fields, and it's just part of what we talked about in the beginning. They really want to show this is a strategic partnership here to stay in all areas, not just defense. And I don't know, if you're watching this as a Ukrainian, you might think, okay, this is sort of laying the groundwork maybe for EU membership later on. Of course, completely different story, very complicated, but still, this is as close as we've seen them be ever.
The second document to be signed is the joint declaration of intent on support of industrial recovery and resilience between the Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development of the Federal Republic of Germany and the Ministry of Economy, Environment and Agriculture of the Republic of Ukraine. The joint declaration will be signed on the Ukrainian side by the Minister of Economy, Environment and Agriculture of Ukraine, Mr. Oleksiy Sobolev, on the German side by the Federal Minister of Economic Cooperation and Development, Ms. Reem Alabali Radovan.
Yeah, look at this symbolism of those pictures, right? Look at that. Maybe I missed the memo. That is entirely possible, but I wasn't aware that they were going to have these ministers come in and sign one after the other with Zelensky and Merz standing in the background, the flags.
And they're very much sitting down like equals. It's what you mentioned before, right? They're not coming here begging. They're actually saying, we have a partnership and we have something to bring to the table.
So if you want to,
This is the end of the signing ceremony.
catch up on your ministers, this Ukrainian ministers and German ministers, it's a good moment to do so.
All right, and now the leaders of the two countries are heading to the podium. Let's listen to what they have to say.
Ladies and gentlemen, once again today I am welcoming the Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky. Volodymyr, a very warm welcome to you once again in Berlin, together with important members of your government. Today we are continuing the German-Ukrainian intergovernmental consultations format, which began over 20 years ago, and that's when it last occurred. Therefore, a very auspicious date today. And we have also approved a common declaration in which we say that our cooperation is more effective and our partnership on the basis of trust is even stronger. The friendship between our societies is stronger than ever. It is therefore absolutely correct that our bilateral relations be elevated to a level of a strategic partnership, because even more than in the past, we want to learn from one another and we want to invest in our mutual future together. We are aspiring to a Ukraine that is democratic, that is a strong partner in a free, safe, and prosperous Europe. And let me add, for a united Europe and one that can assert itself in the world. The cooperation in the weeks and months to come is one that will focus on three priority work areas. Firstly, we are partners working towards a secure Europe. In recent years, Germany has supported Ukraine in an unprecedented manner. In 2026, we have become the most important bilateral partner of Ukraine. And this is reflected in our strong military support. And to that end, we have promised further support today when it comes to air defense capabilities, long-range weapons, artillery, and ammunition. Now, before our talks, you will have seen a brief example of what we're referring to. These are primarily joint productions between Germany and Ukraine, all of which have been developed in recent years on the level of technical capabilities which we had not achieved in the past thus far. Thus, what we are doing in this cooperation is not just of benefit for defense in Ukraine, it is also particularly expedient for us and for our security, because no army in Europe in recent decades is as tested as the Ukrainian armed forces. No society has become more resilient. No defense industry has become more innovative than that of Ukraine. And with our support, we are reinforcing German and European defense capabilities at the same time, as well as our industrial base. And we see this in the number of German-Ukrainian joint ventures and cooperations, of which a few more have been signed into existence today. Our defense ministries have also, or ministers rather, have signed an agreement on exchanging digital data of combat that we can use for our defense, and this is an important agreement. The fact that in Europe we can work together with Ukraine to develop a system of this kind gives us greater independence as Europe, which can only be a good thing. The German-Ukrainian drones that we have already created, that we have just inspected now, are also proof of this. Volodymyr, apart from all of this, and the concern that we have at the ongoing war of aggression of Russia on Ukraine, we are also an advocate of Ukraine succeeding to the EU, even though we know this is not a short-term aim. But it's a strategically important step for greater prosperity and security in Europe, which is why, as the German government, we want to continue to encourage Ukraine to implement its reforms even more than it has thus far, particularly in the area of combating corruption and rule of law. It's worth the effort. Every step taken in this direction is a step taking Ukraine closer to Europe. And I have to say, it is in everyone's interest in Ukraine and in Europe. Another focus has been on the economic dynamism. We will be working more closely together in digitization and in modernizing state-provided services as well. Ukraine is already one of the leading countries in the world in this area, and we will be setting up a working group for the economy and for business. And at the end of the war, we will be ensuring that we can work together even more closely together, because we believe Ukraine offers a real opportunity for Germany economically as well. And we have also signed an agreement about reconstruction in this area, as well as in agriculture, infrastructure, critical resources, and hydrogen. We will be stepping up our cooperation. Ukraine is also important when it comes to energy security. Greater efforts than last year will be necessary as we move forward. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased that today we are celebrating we have agreed the 2027-2028 German-Ukrainian year. We are going to be setting up a city twinning conference as well. Let me just say that even in war, the number of cities twinned between Ukraine and Germany has increased. It has trebled over the number of twin cities before the war. 260 cities in Ukraine and Germany are now twinned. We will be coordinating closely when it comes to Ukrainian citizens who have sought refuge in our country and will make it easier for them to return home. The efforts of the number of Ukrainian men who take refuge here is something we'll be working with Ukraine to limit, because it is crucial that these men are there to help their country, and we need to make progress here. This is in the interest of both countries. Naturally, at the focus of our talks was also the question of how the Russian war of aggression can come to an end. We continue to call for a negotiated end of Russia's attack on Ukraine. We want to see a permanent peace as soon as possible. Ukraine is open for this, but it will not accept a peace dictated by Russia with maximalist requirements. A weakening of the EU, a weakening of NATO are not negotiable options. We need diplomacy that is robust, and we'll be talking about a peace plan and strong security guarantees for Ukraine. And that includes that Kiev continues to be able to stand its ground against the Russian aggressor, and that we support them. Let me just say a word or two about the elections in Hungary, because this will, of course, impact on our ability to support Ukraine. The electorate in Hungary is really historic. What they achieved on Sunday was amazing. More Ukrainian men and women than ever before voted. And with an overwhelming majority, they didn't just vote to get rid of one government, but rather to get rid of a regime. Since after 1989, they've once again voted for freedom. The Hungarians have shown Europe and the world impressively that there is no trend you cannot stop when it comes to right-wing popularism and autocracy. So the pendulum has swung back the other way, which is good news for Europe, good news for Germany, but it's also good news for Ukraine, and I very much hope that everyone sees it that way. I certainly congratulated the future Prime Minister Peter Magyar, and I hope to be able to receive him here on one of his visits. Certainly, Hungary can count on Europe. The reason why I'm saying all of that is because the loan for Ukraine that we agreed on December can now hopefully get underway. The means for military support needs to be paid out quickly. Ukraine needs it urgently. But this will help Ukraine to fund its defense capabilities in the long term, and I hope Russia will take that seriously. We'll be deciding on the 20th sanctions package against Russia and hope that that will step up the pressure against Russia. And now to say something about Russia's sources for financing the military. We are going to step up our measures against its shadow fleet. We'll be working together about the Middle East in order to increase defense capabilities and organize this better. We discussed this as well. Now, with all of these measures, we are pursuing and expanding our strategic partnership, which we have set up as the course that we're heading for, and will now flesh it out. Let me say thank you to Volodymyr and to your government. We're very pleased that you're here together with representatives of your ministries, of your government. We will continue to speak today, but let me just say in advance that this new strategic partnership with Ukraine is one that we will be fleshing out from day one, and it's a clear signal to Europe, but it's also a very clear signal to Russia. In our efforts to defend Ukraine, we will keep up the pace. Russia should end this war as quickly as possible. It has no chance of winning it. Thank you very much, Friedrich, German Chancellor, representatives of the press. I'm very glad that we've had the opportunity to speak today. It's been an important meeting, and we're grateful for Germany's support of Ukraine. It is our #1 partner when it comes to supporting the defense of Ukraine, and the political developments depend very much on how Europe understands how it can best defend its liberty against attempts to destabilize it, and the importance of supporting Ukraine. This is why it is very important that Germany stays as strong as it intends to ensure the independence of Europe long term. Friedrich and I talked about stepping up our ties between our countries, and we're very grateful to Germany and the Chancellor for the agreements that we've been able to sign today. We have 10 such agreements already. These are agreements on different levels, but the most important thing for us is that it's about military cooperation, particularly the missile supply, IRIS-T in particular, but also other missiles that will be delivered for the IRIS-T systems, but also the Patriot systems. And we must do everything we can to ensure that the things that are produced in Europe are the ones that are important for our critical defense. And we need a technological basis, and we need to ensure that we have sufficient military strength to be a bulwark against the Russians, to defend not just Ukraine, but Europe as well. And this is why we will be producing anti-ballistic missile systems to protect us against any kind of drones, any kinds of aerial attacks. And we are working together to achieve this result. Ukraine is prepared to make its contribution to this. We have concluded a drone agreement, and these are means for a modern defense system, and this is starting to bear fruit. Our experience can be incorporated in EU defense capabilities. Our experience is also proving useful in the conflicts in the Middle East, and the drone deal that we've concluded here is an effective one. The joint production of drones that we have talked about today is important. The Pearl program is important. It's about having air defense missile systems, and Germany has done so much for us already. I'm very grateful to Germany and to you, Friedrich. The cooperation between Germany and Ukraine has now been elevated to a strategic partnership, as the German Chancellor has already said now, with the declarations that we have signed into force today. And our German-Ukrainian intergovernmental consultations are very important here. Energy and the protection of our energy infrastructure are very important. We've been working closely together with European institutions here to ensure that we can continue to work towards closer ties between Ukraine and Europe. Cooperation in the area of defense is key, and the German-Ukrainian intergovernmental consultations began 20 years ago. Hopefully, we will have another one before we have to wait another 20 years, and hopefully it will take place in peace. This is a format that is very important. These intergovernmental consultations are very quick. We have the defense ministry or the defense ministers meeting each other and the economic and environmental ministers meeting each other. It's about developing our defense industry together and generating new jobs. It's about the energy sector and reconstruction of Ukraine. We want German companies to be actively involved in enhancing our energy capacities and rebuilding the energy infrastructure that has been destroyed by the Russian military. And despite the ongoing Russian military strikes and the terrible combination of cruise missiles and drones, we have to ensure that by next winter we are able to effectively defend our energy infrastructure. What's important for peace is that we find a way to end this war as quickly as possible, and diplomatic efforts must be made to get us there. We have to also step up the pressure on Russia to bring them to the negotiating table. This is very important for Ukraine. Thank you to Germany. Thank you to you personally, Friedrich, for understanding this. And thank you for this visit. And Slava Ukraina.
Herr Präsident, wir haben eine Frage zum Drone Deal.
President of Ukraine, we have a question about the drone deal. We've understood that it's a series of drones. What sort of scale are we talking about? Thank you for the question. We've been working with Germany in this area for some time now, and today we were able to inspect the results of this cooperation ourselves. Today, the economy, the government, and the people of our countries understand how important this cooperation is, and we're very grateful that the European military and the German military are interested in harnessing our experience, and that has led to the drone deal. There's a founding document for this drone deal that we're still working on. We have agreed that we're going to conclude this founding document, and we concluded a deal as well in the Middle East, but this will be a separate document because Germany is a very, very important partner for us. This is going to be the largest deal of its kind in Europe, and our teams will be working out the details. Chancellor, you've just talked about the importance of Ukraine joining the EU, but you've also talked about the problems that might be there. Even after the recent elections in Hungary, there are other member states that are against a very quick succession to EU. Can you offer any advice to Ukraine? Is there an EFTA or similar association that can be offered to Ukraine in the meantime? Now, you also talked about further development of the Pearl program. I wonder if you can tell us a bit more about that. Is Ukraine still relying on American weapons after all the support they've had from Germany and Ukraine and Europe? Thank you for your question. We want to show Ukraine ways in which they can get closer to the EU step by step. It's not going to be second-class membership. It's a process where we bring them closer, and there is homework that Ukraine has. Europe has also things they need to do. And we have criteria for accession for membership. But one thing that's important to me, apart from any roadmaps, there has to be a solid involvement of Ukraine in Europe. And the people of Ukraine need to know that their future, if they want it, can be in Europe. And for that, we want to pave the way, well aware as we are that we both have to put our house in order. But if we're talking about common security, then Ukraine has one of the countries with the largest territory who could be a member of the EU, and indeed should be. And how to achieve this goal is something we're going to be talking about. I certainly, speaking for myself and for the government, have no doubt that they will accede to you. Thank you for your question, particularly with reference to the weapons that Ukraine will be using. Most of the weapons that Ukraine is using long range on the battlefield itself are for direct defense. And many of these weapons are ones that were made in Ukraine itself, indeed most of them. But the various drone deals we have concluded are based on us manufacturing twice as many drones as we need ourselves because of our production capacities. What we're lacking is the financing to really work to capacity, and so the 90 billion credit for the Ukraine will hopefully not remain blocked for long. And once that's freed up, we will be able to throw even more at the battlefield. And we're talking about particularly air defense against ballistic missiles. There are simply not enough production capabilities in Europe. And we need to ensure that Ukraine works with EU to produce these anti-ballistic missile defense systems. But we must ensure that we can support our people. So we need this program. Now, with reference to the EU, I'm very pleased that Friedrich and Germany in general are supporting us. Everyone knows that we don't want NATO light or EU light. We want proper membership in the EU. I think that the EU and NATO can really use us as a partner as well. Our military, which is a strong military, because no one needs Ukrainian military light in these positions. So I think this is of benefit to both sides.
All right, a lot to discuss. We're back in the studio here with Max Hoffman, our Berlin bureau chief, and Nick Connolly joins us on the line from Kyiv. Max highlighted the strategic cooperation with the goal of achieving strong democratic Ukraine that is a partner in securing Europe. He said, however, that in getting there, Ukraine needed to keep up the reforms, especially in terms of corruption. Any surprises you saw, any takeaways that you didn't see coming before this press conference, before the signing ceremony?
The range of topics overall was what was expected, more or less, and also the main message, I would say, was what we discussed beforehand. This is a very broad, important strategic partnership to Ukraine and to Germany, and they intend to keep it up. Going away a bit from the main topic, I was a bit surprised that Merz talked about regime change in Hungary. That kind of seemed like a very forceful language when it comes to this, calling the Orban government
Might have been a
regime.
translation issue there, though. Did you hear him say that in
I
German as well?
I
Okay.
only heard the translation,
Okay.
yeah. But by the way, kudos to our interpreter. This is always
Of
super
course.
challenging
Catherine
to do
is the
this.
best. We're so glad to have her.
So I trust her. But yeah, if you want to make sure this is what he said, you might want to listen to it again. We'll do the same thing. So that's one of the moments where I was, okay, interesting. Very strong message to Russia also from the German Chancellor. You have no chance of winning.
Yep.
Right there. And yeah, when it comes to EU membership for Ukraine, that's obviously a bit dicey because you can't just promise it, right? Especially not as one single country, even if it's the biggest country in the EU with Germany. There are processes there, and just go to Turkey and ask them how things can go. You know, they've been accession, they've been not anymore, but they really tried to
Canada
become
for many, many years,
for many years, or on the Balkans as well, Serbia, for example. So this can drag on forever.
And Zelensky was very clear. He said they don't want EU light, they don't want NATO light, they want the real deal, right?
And that's why you need certain standards. For example, combating corruption is one of the main things. I think that's the one he mentioned. He mentioned another one too, trying just to figure out which one it was. Combating corruption was probably the main thing. So what Merz is trying to do here is, without making promises because he cannot, making it clear that he's in favor of this and that there is a path forward, but that it's up to the Ukrainians also to make this happen and to give them perspective, really tie Ukraine to the West, so that Ukrainians see their future in the European Union. But we discussed it beforehand. The German Chancellor said it. That is going to be, you know, even if it's shorter than anything we've ever seen, it's still going to be a pretty long and probably also thorny process.
Obviously. We'll get into the nitty-gritty in a bit. But first, Nick in Ukraine, in Kyiv, give us your takeaway.
I think this is all pretty as expected. I think the Ukrainians are willing to go through this and become strategic partners of Germany, even if that isn't the same thing as EU light. They're willing to go through it, but the real prize is obviously EU membership, as discussed. And the fact that Friedrich Merz said this wouldn't happen in the short term was obviously not something they want to hear. But he also didn't say it would take 10 years or more, as we heard yesterday out of Budapest. I think people here are discussing lots of different options. When Ursula von der Leyen was in town for the 4th anniversary of Russia's invasion, she was kind of implying that 2030, sometime around there, was realistic. That would obviously still be very, very fast by EU standards. But I think the Ukrainians are still going to be looking for a kind of more out there political statement, even if the Germans can't promise it, but they can say we would like this to happen. That at least would be the expectation from here. So I think that's not the end of it. I think there'll be more pressure there. Obviously, they're clear that in terms of governance, fighting corruption, that is something that they're not going to get away from. There has been also a lot of pressure from Ukrainian society on the government to do more there. So I think we will see more big corruption cases coming to the courts, more people in power being basically shown up and potentially jailed. So I think that is something that is not going away. But I think the fact that Ukraine is now also being seen as a partner that not only asks for support, but also provides things that Germany doesn't have in terms of knowledge about how to deal with drones, but also in terms of using AI on the battlefield. Those are all things I think that are very welcome and that President Zelensky is very happy to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Many of the points that you both just raised are, of course, also being echoed in the chat on YouTube and on TikTok. Thank you all so much for submitting your questions. Keep them coming. We'll be here for another little while. And My Art Blitz on TikTok actually commented, if the EU is to have strong cooperation with Ukraine, corruption must be addressed. They are doing that. Another thing that was on the table, which is also being discussed here in the chat on YouTube especially, is the peace talks. Germany was not a party to the talks that were mediated by the U.S. The German chancellor said that there had to be, and let me quote him here, robust diplomacy. They needed a peace plan and strong security guarantees. Does Germany view itself in a position of getting more actively involved in actually negotiating that kind of outcome? And how realistic is it, the fronts where they stand right now?
I think, I mean, the German chancellor, he said it, 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 he said Germany has always wanted to be more involved, especially when it comes to diplomacy. That is the German path, and you also see it when the German foreign minister, Johann Wadephul, for example, talks about the war in the Middle East. The Germans want to be that voice at the moment, upholding support for multilateral institutions, upholding diplomacy. And even if that might have sounded a bit hollow, only 2 months back or 6 weeks back. But now, seeing that the peace talks in the format US, Russia, Ukraine didn't work, Ukraine on the back burner here, didn't work. What's happening in Iran, it's not working. So you could argue that those voices for robust diplomacy are gaining more weight on the international stage. And of course, the Europeans, if there ever is a peace agreement and whatever the terms, the Europeans are going to have to be on board. Yeah. They're the neighbors. They're going to have to do something. Peacekeepers. Nick mentioned it earlier. All kinds of things you can think about. And I would go as far, and I hope our users agree, common sense would dictate that you bring the people that actually have to play an important role in what comes after to the table pretty early. Know what I mean?
Adams 8847 actually commented, Europe needs to force Putin to the table. The war will not end until Europe takes an active hand with Putin. Nick, you're in Kyiv. Is that a sentiment shared there? Is that something that is seen as realistic? We're in the 5th year of this war. Do you think that there is still a belief that the Europeans, maybe now with that power shift in Hungary, are going to take a more decided stance against Vladimir Putin?
I mean, that would certainly be the hope here in Kyiv. I'm not sure if people really believe that is going to happen. Just give you one example connected to Hungary. So there's that Druzhba pipeline that takes Russian oil through Ukraine to Hungary, also to Slovakia. And that basically was damaged some while back as part of a Russian attack. That was what we heard from the Ukrainian authorities. Since then, it hasn't been operational, and that obviously led to huge tensions, particularly between Orban and Zelensky. Orban basically accusing Ukraine of turning off the tap on purpose. And we have seen evidence that basically Ukraine is under a lot of pressure, not just from the Hungarians under Orban, but also from Brussels to make that problem go away, to get that pipeline back into action, back into operation. So at the one side, we have Europe talking about reducing dependence on Russian energy, on stopping imports of, for instance, Russian energy by sea. I mean, most pipeline imports have stopped, but by sea, there are still imports of liquefied gas, for instance. And at the same time, pushing Ukraine to allow Russia to make more money supplying oil to Hungary, even though Hungary has had years to look for different suppliers and actually seemingly has got more dependent on Russian oil since this war began. So that all doesn't stack up from a Ukrainian perspective in terms of depriving Moscow of the money to carry on this war. And now, obviously, with everything happening in the Middle East, the oil price going through the roof, Russia's coffers are going to be filled much quicker than they were in the past. There was a real sense that before this Iran war, that actually Russia was really running into financial difficulties and was really having to start cutting spending at home, having to raise more taxes to pay for this war. And now suddenly they've got this windfall thanks to Trump. And that is something that is a real problem in terms of Ukraine being able to not only stop Russia advancing, but maybe trying to get the upper hand on the battlefield if Russia suddenly has all this cash. So I think this will be a crucial test. And I don't think for now it looks like Brussels is willing to tell the new Hungarian government to forget about the Druzhba pipeline.
Yeah. Max, the German Chancellor called the election result in Hungary good news, especially looking at the possibility of further sanctions and that EU loan that we talked about at length earlier. Do you think there will be fresh momentum to ramp up support for Ukraine now that there's a change in command in Hungary? Or are we testing the waters just now?
There's certainly going to be less obstacles to ramping up support even more. There are other factors that play in, the financial factor. Even for the EU, something like a 90 billion euro loan, that's a lot of money. especially in the economic circumstances that the European countries find themselves in, even before the Iran war started, with all the energy costs going through the roof. Inflation, again, is a topic. But if you're watching us, for example, in the United States, you know what I'm talking about, because it's kind of the same thing there. And so there are other obstacles to this. But yes, one, arguably the biggest obstacle to supporting Ukraine more on a nation level has been removed. There are still others. Nick mentioned Slovakia, for example. And never forget, this is an association or a union of democracies. Things can change very quickly, especially next year when we have elections in France.
Yeah. And I hope I'm joined now by Chief Political Editor Michaela Küfner. She's at the Chancellery, just got out of that press conference. I can see her, and I hope we can also hear her. What a day at the Chancellery, Michaela. We didn't know what was coming when we got up this morning. Now we all rushed over there. Tell us your biggest takeaways from today.
Well, clearly, both sides want to elevate the relationship out of this continuous loop of a crisis mode into a more reliable platform. And the big issue there, of course, that you already touched upon for sure, is that there is this urge for fast-track EU accession from the Ukrainian side, which everybody knows that won't be met by 2027. At the same time, there are now businesses here. The Chancellery turned essentially into a showroom for drones, and both sides are talking economic cooperation. Ukraine wants to demonstrate that it's able to move out of the corner of being a victim of this war of aggression to actually a supplier of drone expertise, but also capacity. And that really here is the platform that the German Chancellor wanted to provide for the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to showcase that. Of course, Moscow is watching as well, and to send a signal that there is more and more momentum to building own European German strength here. Of course, always with an eye on the flailing support from the US side.
From the German perspective, how significant are the 10 deals that have been signed today?
I think it was very interesting. I mean, one is a letter of intent for reconstruction. That's from the Ministry of Economic Cooperation. But there's a really interesting one, which is on military data sharing, which allows next level development of weapon systems. That is something where Germany also has an interest. And quite clearly, Friedrich Merz was very outspoken in saying Germany has been the largest provider of assistance, of financial aid, since the US essentially backed out of its previous commitment under the previous administration. And now Germany also is voicing more and more its own economic interests in Ukraine. And this here is where the basis for that is being founded. But of course, there's always this major caveat. The Europeans, Germany is not at the table when any kind of peace or ceasefire deal is discussed. So far, that is without the European side actually having a say. And the big question is whether in the end it will be the United States who dominates in making deals when it comes, for instance, to rare earths, which were also mentioned here, and how much will be left for the European partners who are doing much of the heavy lifting these days.
Mm-hmm. Merz talked about 2027-28 being the German-Ukrainian year. Do you know what he meant by that?
Well, I would say that every year, as long as this conflict continues, will be a German-Ukrainian year, but there will be more and more cultural cooperation. And we heard that those partnerships of cities actually rose threefold since the beginning of the war. So this is being expanded, moving away from the continuous crisis mode to a platform of cooperation. That's also why this meeting here today was labeled a consultation, where several members of cabinet, of course, foreign ministers, defense ministers, but also beyond that, the economic minister from the Ukrainian side, development minister from the German side was at the table. This is heading towards more and more normalcy of close European partners, but still, of course, in these very exceptional circumstances of Ukraine fighting off that war of aggression against Russia and facing a lot of resistance on its desired path within the European Union, which is more feasible, but eventually also into NATO. But we don't want to open that kettle of fish whether NATO will actually survive long enough for that.
Chief Political Editor Michaela Kufner at the Chancellery here in Berlin. Thank you so much. And thank you, Nick, in Kyiv, too. That was Nick Connolly, our Ukraine correspondent. Before we go, here's a short recap on the Ukrainian president's visit to Berlin, where he was welcomed by Chancellor Merz with military honors. Germany and Ukraine have signed a defense deal, and President Zelensky said he offered Germany a comprehensive drone deal. Germany and Ukraine have signed a deal on reconstruction. Merz said Ukraine's reconstruction will also be a considerable economic opportunity for German companies. Chancellor Merz said a lasting peace in Ukraine is urgently needed and that the new strategic partnership with Ukraine sends a clear signal to Russia. Quote, Russia has no chance of winning the war. And that's our time. A big thank you to all our guests, especially you who came all the way to the studio. Thank you for joining us, especially those who contributed to the conversation. We love hearing from you and finding out what you're curious about, and I hope we were able to answer some of your most burning questions. Take care, and until next time.